Good morning. On behalf of the Media School here at the University of Gloucestershire and our partners in HEPI who have worked with us to devise and promote this discussion, I'd like to welcome you to this event on the important topic of universities and the media, friend or foe. You will be able to post questions to the panel during the session. In Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to do this, not the chat feature. And our chair, Rachel Hewitt, will be able to put those questions to the panel during the Q&A session at the end of the speeches from the panellists. As I covered in my recent blog for HEPI, from the perspective of someone working in the higher education sector, it often feels that universities are not treated fairly by the media or indeed politicians. What feels so unfair? After all, many university activities are widely celebrated, such as developing a vaccine for COVID-19 or educating nurses. But despite this, universities as institutions have been on the rough end of media attention in recent years. This includes regular coverage of high executive salaries, snowflake students, lack of free speech, tuition fees causing graduate debt, a poor record on access and participation, and an apparent crisis in student mental health, to mention just 7 examples. This can feel unfair. Because working in the sector, we know there is a counter-narrative struggling to be heard. Consider free speech. Apparently, the issue is so pressing that primary legislation is required. But a 2020 survey of students' unions found just 6 events from almost 10,000, that's 0.06%, involving an external speaker were cancelled in 2019-20. Even official figures from the Office for Students showed that fewer than 0.1% of requests for external speakers were blocked in 2017-18. Yet the issue for the sector is not simply how to respond to criticism in a more effective way, but how to put forward a more positive position in the first place. That is a debate which is desperately needed if the sector is to avoid continuing public criticism. In a recent HEPI blog, I suggested 6 ideas for this debate. First, we have to accept that there is a legitimate interest in the way in which universities operate. We must accept the reality of the situation we face, that the scale and importance of our sector justifies media attention. Second, given that media attention is now a fixture of university life, universities must engage more openly with debates about higher education. National media debates are rarely comfortable, but avoiding the debate and assuming no coverage is a good outcome is not the solution. Third, university leaders need to take a role in discussing issues beyond the sector. This leadership cannot be left to vice-chancellors alone. Senior staff, whether professional or academic, have a role in using their voice to engage in public discussion. Fourth, universities lack adequate coordination at the sector level and have failed to respond to these issues collaboratively and effectively, despite the often amazing and sometimes undervalued work of UUK. But UUK cannot be expected to bring the sector together alone. The sector must want to work collectively across mission group boundaries, accepting compromise where necessary, so that UUK can amplify existing narratives. Fifth, both politicians and the media rely on and respond to public sentiment, so speaking to the public directly is both important in itself and important for the indirect influence the public exerts. Starting at a local, civic level is the logical way into building greater public interest in institutions. And sixth, if the university sector fails to engage, old stories can re-emerge. The old idea that too many people go to university had seemingly gone away, for example. However, the argument has now returned, despite, or maybe because of, record applications and acceptances to university during 2020-21, with the current government openly contending that too many people do indeed go to university. Universities, therefore, need to more openly, more frequently, and with greater confidence promote the basic tenets that underpin the sector. Universities therefore need to explore ways of presenting themselves in a collaborative and positive way in the media and with government, but also with the public. This could enable the university sector to capture the esteem with which some university activities are already held. This debate and the attempt to reorientate coverage of universities is needed not simply to ensure the benefits of higher education continue to develop, but it is also vital to avoid the erosion of such critical aspects of the sector as institutional autonomy and the importance of aspiration. I'm now pleased to hand over to one of our journalism students in the media school, Ulani Seaman, who will introduce our distinguished panel today, and Rachel Hewitt, Director of Policy and Advocacy at HEPI, who will chair the debate following our speaker's opening remarks.
Good morning. Our first guest this morning is Chris Skidmore. Chris is a former minister jointly at the Department for Education and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy until February last year, and previously Minister of State at the Department of Health and Social Care. He's been Conservative MP for Kingswood since 2010.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this panel today. When I was a minister, I did feel that amongst all the myriad of policy debates and the sort of detail of those debates that universities are so keen to get into, one thing that was often forgotten about in that policy debate is that public policy is also about communication. And if you're unable to effectively communicate a policy effectively and simply, then that policy will rapidly lose its ability to influence and enhance the state of the country. And that's true not only in politics, but I think also for all institutions of which universities are clearly a part. What I'd like to do with my opening remarks actually was sort of break them down, to start with the who, then move on to the why, and then finally on to the how. What do I mean by who? So we're talking in this event about the media. Now, the media is no less the media than students are students, or a university is a university. There is a diversity of provision within the media, just as there is in the higher education sector, just as no one student can be classified in the same homogenous group. And it's important, I think, to recognise that universities see, or should see, the media in terms of a variety of different groups. I certainly do as a politician. I know certainly most in government and in politics do also. So you have the sector media. So you've got John speaking later, and they're incredibly important channels of influence in order to make sure the sector is aware of what's going on. Policymakers use them all the time, and we have a number of channels. Of course, HEPI also is a key part of that, and it reaches out to a specific think tank community, a policy community, a higher education community. Do not believe, though, that just because something, and I hope John doesn't mind me saying this, appears in Times Higher, that means the public recognise what is going on in your university. Welcome though sort of coverage is in the university's page of The Guardian, is not necessarily going to get cut through across even a wider political sphere in Westminster, let alone into local communities. And so what I would say in terms of the next part of a sort of a media who and a prosopography, as it were, would be then to look at sort of the wider national media. And with that, obviously, you've got the education correspondents who are on your side, are willing to work with you. We'll talk about building a relationship with the relevant education correspondents and the national media later. But don't forget also the political correspondents, because they have as much influence in terms of some of the topics of debate that might be chosen, which you may see sort of universities as being beaten with various sticks, such as free speech or sort of wokeness. But that's not necessarily the education correspondent sort of doing that work. That might be the political journalists. So, if you're looking at free speech, Christopher Hope at the Telegraph is a sort of one-man band who's sort of writing these articles. It's worth universities being able to reach out to him as well. And then I would say, never ignore your local media, never ignore your local BBCs. And with the local media, I'd also say it's not just your sort of, in my area, the Bristol Evening Post, the Manchester Evening News and all those people. It's also increasingly the advertorials, the free magazines that sort of go through people's doors. I use those very effectively as a local member of parliament, because they actually, you know, are reaching out to every single household in my constituency. And I would say for universities looking to build local strategies that show them as civic universities, there is no harm in getting in contact in advance with either your local education reporter, inviting them to the campus to sort of talk through what you're doing, because ultimately it's about preparation as well, and we'll come on to that in terms of the why, but building those relationships in advance is far more productive and then provides a positive facing strategy rather than a reactive one. And that's the last place you want to be, in a sort of downward spiral of having to react to events with the media, because you've lost control, and it's all about control. So building those contacts in the who for the media is absolutely vital if you want to retain control of your communication strategy. And then secondly, why use the media? You know, the media will never be your friends, but they can be there almost like heralds on a battlefield to try to help out and record and to sort of, you know, help, you know, get your message across. You know, you can never sort of assume that they are going to give you the coverage you want to have, and you should never get angry with them if you don't get the coverage that you don't get. But nevertheless, you have to think, I think, to start with, about what are the outcomes that you wish to achieve as a university. You know, is it that you want to promote your research? Is it about sort of trumpeting your university? I think sometimes universities are a bit tiresome, because often all the press releases are about how great your university is, not necessarily, and what you've done, not necessarily what you're planning to do. And what I would say sort of actually, it's all about your audience. You know, you're focusing again on your audiences, and you might be talking about your research, but local communities won't necessarily understand what some of the level of that research is. They won't understand what graphene is, for example, if you want to talk about some of the latest sort of spin out in that technology. So I think you need to be focusing obviously on students and thinking about sort of, you know, students who might be wanting to come to university, but don't forget their parents or even their grandparents, because that's sort of, I think, one of the big issues, is that actually if they're trying to challenge the perceptions of those people who've not gone to university, yet are terrified that their granddaughter or grandson is now going to go to university, in their minds be saddled with debt, and what are they getting for it? And some of this graduate outcomes debate has spun out, I think, of those fears from generations that haven't gone to university. So being able to target your audiences effectively, and I would say communities that, you know, very few people go to universities, you know, having strategies that, you know, reach out beyond the media to try to reach them, as I said, through the advertorial papers, you know, or even leafleting in those communities. And then I would say, you know, when it comes to media strategy for, you know, policymakers and members of parliament, you know, reaching out to them, because they can also help you with your press releases. Often universities think, oh, we've got to produce the press release ourselves. The best and most effective press release is where you've actually got a community of like-minded individuals who are willing to support you, and maybe be a quote in your press release. And maybe, you know, it's not necessarily Professor such and such who you should be getting the quote from. It might be somebody who works in a local business. It might be a member of parliament who's able to back your scheme. You know, looking for allies as part of your communication strategy is equally important. And then I would say, finally, in terms of how, as I said, I've begun to sort of suggest ways in which you should form a press release, form, you know, those connections in advance. But I would just end on this plea that, you know, repetition is your friend. You cannot underestimate how important it is to endlessly pound away at your message. You know, this is what politicians do. You know, people may mock levelling up, but it has cut through in a way that talking about somehow equalizing sort of GDA spend across regionalities and all this stuff, you know, has never had. And it's the simplicity of language that is so important here. You know, Auden once said that time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent and indifferent in a weak to a beautiful physique worships language and forgives all those by whom it lives. And, you know, as journalism students, you'll know how important sort of crafting a simple message is, but it is also about repeating that message endlessly. And when you're sick of finally saying it, and someone will come around to you and say, you know what, I didn't know that the University of Bath was doing this in my community, but I read about it the other day, and that might have taken you a year to get there, but it would have been worth it. You know, never underestimate the importance of communication, but never also underestimate how long it can take in order to communicate ideas, particularly difficult ideas in the higher education sector. And so if you're thinking about sort of, having to react to events, you've left it far too late. As I said, a proactive strategy about where you want to be, understanding the outcomes you want and the audiences you wish to target, and also the particular areas of the media where you want to build influence, is all part of an effective communication strategy that should start way in advance of actually the outcomes you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris Skidmore. Our next guest is Kirsty Walker. Kirsty is Director of UCL Media Relations. A former journalist, Kirsty spent the first 17 years of her career working for national newspapers on the Daily Express and Daily Mail, spending nearly 13 years as a political correspondent based in Westminster.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today and for instigating such an important conversation about an issue which, it's fair to say, is exercising many of us in the higher education sector. And I'd like to begin with some reflections on why universities are under such scrutiny, why changes to the broader media landscape have deep and profound implications on the way we engage with media. And finally, I'll try to offer some suggestions on a way forward. Firstly, I think we need to all acknowledge that anything relating to universities is big news these days, and that is not going to change anytime soon. Just 5 years ago, there were around 4,500 stories about universities in national daily and Sunday newspapers. Last year, that figure had grown to more than 7,000. And if the start of this year is anything to go by, this is only going to rise. And as the title of today's discussion, Friend or Foe, makes clear, we're very clear that many of these stories are negative and paint the sector in a very unfair, sometimes, light. Just to take a snapshot, in the last week alone, the sector has been at the centre of a series of negative headlines on issues such as anti-Semitism, culture wars, decolonisation, free speech, sexual harassment, tuition fee refunds, arts funding cuts, graduate job prospects, foreign donations, China, mental health, and the list goes on. And that is just in the last 7 days. And as any director of comms or media in the higher education sector will tell you, crisis comms is an increasingly important and time-consuming, if not some might say all-consuming, part of our roles. And as someone who's spent a large part of my career working as a national newspaper journalist, even I have been slightly taken aback at the scale of negative coverage when I turned poacher turned gamekeeper and joined the sector for UCL. So why do we get such a bad press? I think part of the reason is that the higher education sector in the UK has undergone huge and significant changes in a relatively short space of time. We've got record numbers of 18-year-olds attending university. We've seen the introduction of a new regulator in the form of the OFS, which is wanting to make its mark, and a host of new metrics and measurements from REF, TEF, and now we have KEF. And that's not to mention the still ongoing challenges of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, Brexit, the current consultation on overhauling of university admissions, and ongoing uncertainty about the future of research funding. It's fair to say that running a university is highly challenging and complex, with multiple internal and external stakeholders and pressure. And as the Times former education editor Rosie Bennett argued in her recent HEPI blog, Mixed Media, What Universities Need to Know About Journalists, it is the introduction of tuition fees in particular that I think, agree with Rosie, that's made universities become the ultimate consumer story. And that means that stories about the sector often take on a David versus Goliath campaigning style and are seen through the lens of value for money. And at the same time as our sector has undergone complex changes, the media landscape has also changed dramatically. Gone are the days when the majority of people bought a paper in the morning, watched the TV news in the evening, and had little or no exposure to news in between. We have a 24-hour news cycle now, and the internet has given rise to a multitude of news sites, bloggers, Twitter accounts, and mobile apps vying to be the first to break important news. That hunger for constant news puts greater pressure on and demand for journalists to bring in stories that drive clickbait through to web platforms. And at the same time, traditional news brands have seen a dramatic drop in print readership and advertising revenues. The numbers of specialist education correspondents, those journalists who have deep knowledge and understanding and close contacts with the sector, have declined. And what we have now is a toxic mix of more generalised news reporters looking for clickbait headlines to drive readership across multiple platforms. I also want to speak in defence of journalists. We must also accept that our media plays a fundamental role in exposing wrongdoing and bad practice wherever it lies. Take, for example, The Guardian's long-running campaign led by David Batty, which has shone a light on sexual misconduct, bullying and harassment in UK universities. The coverage has been hard-hitting, relentless and quite rightly uncomfortable for the sector. But it has also led to meaningful change, with many universities now overhauling their policies, reporting processes and support systems as a result. Good quality and campaigning journalism like this deserves to be commended, and we should welcome this scrutiny when we fall short. One area where I would say that journalists are our friends when it comes to communicating is with research findings. Every day, you'll pick up national media and see it filled with stories about the latest scientific breakthroughs or new pieces of research that's saving lives and directly influencing government policy. Academics also engage constructively and positively every day with the media, offering expert comment on topical news stories to inform public understanding of complex issues, and long may this continue. The coronavirus pandemic has also, I believe, led to far greater public understanding of and respect for university research and the scientists who power it. Ipsos Mori's recent survey of trust in scientists found that the majority of people trust scientists, and 6 in 10 say that the benefits of science in the UK are greater than any harmful effects. This reflects other research, such as Ipsos Mori's Veracity Index, which has consistently shown scientists to be one of the most trusted professions in the country. So while there is some positive news, we also need to face the fact that universities and the higher education sector are going to remain at the top of the news agenda for some time. And the question we're being asked today is, how can we counterbalance some of that more negative narrative and engage more effectively with the media? Firstly, I'm going to agree with Matthew and Rosie Bennett here. The university leaders need to be more proactive in their engagement with the media and politicians on the big issues of the day. Failing to engage in the debate risks making the sector look defensive at best and at worst complacent or incompetent. It also plays into what I believe is quite an unfair narrative. The VCs are out of touch, stuck in their ivory towers. And while of course I understand the reticence to engage, and let's face it, there are risks that come with media appearances, there is a bigger danger in doing nothing. And when I say engage with the media, as Chris has pointed out, I mean all media, not just supposedly friendly journalists who write for less hostile outlets or media outlets that will enable us to talk amongst ourselves. But senior leaders need to also widen the audience that we engage with by talking to the likes of the Daily Mail, the Daily Express and the Sun. And most journalists, and having been one myself, I know this, would welcome the opportunity for a off the record or informal chat, and to hear and listen to the other side of the story. And we cannot just leave media responses to sector bodies. The more university leaders engage, the more journalists will see them as part of a wider national debate and proactively come to them for contribution and comment. And like it or not, the media, particularly the right-wing media at the moment, has a huge influence and sway over our politicians and government. I would like to suggest that a lot of university leaders should start by adding Mail Online to the list of publications they read over their morning coffee, although I know some might balk at the idea. Universities need to be better at harnessing our advocates as well from our huge communities. There are over 400,000 staff employed in UK higher education institutes, and when there's an army of university alum out there, of course, as well as our partners in industry, employers, charities and the NHS, we need to work harder to create a culture in which our staff, students feel proud and part of the institutions they work for, not separate from it, as is often the case in academia. We cannot just leave the job of communicating the value and impact of our universities to VCs, sector bodies, or university media teams. The sector as a whole also needs to be much more collaborative, generous, and proactive in communicating the public impact of our work. The good news is that there's a lot of work underway here in this area. UUK, for example, has been running the #MadeItUni campaign, which aims to bring to life the impact of universities up and down the country. The big thing about this campaign is it's been showcasing stories from universities in a relatable way that demonstrates real public and human interest impact. But we need to do more together, and individual institutions need to share and champion the successes of others. And the Russell Group's recent statement on the principles of free speech, for an example, is a way in which the sector can mobilise together with a shared voice on issues where there are shared concerns. Universities also need to demonstrate that they're publicly engaged and serving their communities. We can't just rely on the media to shift public sentiment. So it's important that we show that we're open, engaged by working with and supporting local businesses, working with local councils and organisations to enhance the lives of local people. Research by Britain Thinks on behalf of Universities UK found that while 78% of those surveyed feel positive or neutral about universities, only 1 in 10 are likely to advocate for us. And there is therefore a challenge for the sector to build greater positivity and understanding of the things we do beyond undergraduate teaching. And also, finally, we need to reach out beyond traditional media to communicate to our audiences. So of course, while the major news brands remain important and influential, we need to broaden our communication through social media, digital platforms, and innovate. UCL, for example, is investing in and broadening our reach through our Disruptive Discoveries podcast series. Universities also need to be as good as the top consumer or retail companies in investing in and promoting our brands and the values of them. Finally, I think we need to be honest about the scale of the challenge and that there is no easy or simple solution. None of the things we will discuss today will likely to shift the media narrative overnight. It's going to take time and a lot more conversations like this one today. But by being proactive, transparent and engaging in the way we communicate with the external world through the media, we may be able to provide some balance and increase understanding of the important and valuable work that our universities do, not just for our students and staff, but for our wider society here in the UK and globally.
Walker. Our next guest is John Gill. John is editor of Times Higher Education, described in his LinkedIn profile as the world's leading source of news, view and reviews in higher education. He's previously held roles as news editor, deputy news editor and reporter with the same paper.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I don't use LinkedIn and haven't done for about 10 years, so I can't remember writing that, but I'm sure it's entirely accurate. I'd like to thank Rachel and Matthew for inviting me to be part of this discussion and for posing an interesting question. Are we friend or foe to universities? And I think it is an interesting question, but I also think in the long tradition of people asked to respond to binary choices that I'm going to feel obliged to conclude that the answer isn't that simple, because it's undoubtedly the case that the press is not looking for ways to glorify what you do. Journalism isn't PR. At the same time, neither is, in most cases, is the media out to monster you for the sake of it, even if it feels that way sometimes. So I think it's worth perhaps going back to basics and asking what the media is there to do. And the answer in that case is usually to report and commentate on issues for a defined audience. Now that sounds incredibly boring, and I would like to reassure all the journalism students listening that journalism is anything but boring, but the audience bit, as Chris and Kirsty as well have said already, is really important, because media outlets are never 100% neutral. They're looking at issues through the lens of editorial decision making, and that's influenced to a certain extent by the individuals involved, whether it's editors or news editors or columnists, people like Chris Hope, who after all are being paid to have a view, and the stronger the view is, the better. But the real point isn't the views of those individuals, the vast majority of whom will have personally benefited from a university education, by the way, so they will be well aware of the advantages it has given them. The real point is that they are channeling very often the views or perceived views of their readers, or their listeners, or their viewers, so their audience. Now, you may take the view that that process of mediation doesn't work very well, that far from reflecting what different sections of society think about universities, the media instead tells people what to think, perhaps ossifying out-of-date perspectives or making inaccurate ideas mainstream. One current example, which I think many in higher education would say falls into this latter category, is the now widely held view that free speech is under sustained attack on university campuses. And if you think that this very current and ongoing narrative shows how the media is peddling a popular falsehood, then I would agree up to a point. But I think it's a common mistake, and one that smacks of putting heads in the sand, to just blame a terrible media for covering the wrong things in the wrong way. So my first suggestion is not to fall into that trap. Instead, as others have said, engage with criticism fully and reflect on the perspectives that are being channeled through media coverage that you do not like and agree with, as well as that which you do. Now, the question of editorial tone isn't just about the stories which are covered, it's also about the way they're covered. And I'd like to give you a recent example of this. THE recently ran a story on Bolton University publishing a written justification for its Vice-Chancellor's pay in the university's annual accounts. This is a new OFS requirement, but in Bolton's case, it ran a justification that was 2 pages long and was packed with hyperbole. THE's news article on this was original reporting. We wrote the story, but it was also very straightforward. The details speak for themselves, and our audience understands the newsworthiness insofar as these written justifications are new to the sector. The Times then ran a follow-up in which all the facts were the same, but with added commentary from Lord Adonis, scourge of vice-chancellors and a man not afraid of hyperbole himself. And here's a taste of what he had to add to the basic facts of the piece. This statement reads more like a eulogy in praise of a communist or fascist dictator than a description of the services of a low-ranking university vice-chancellor who is grossly overpaid and should be returning more than half his salary to his students. What will he want next? A mausoleum in the centre of Bolton with his body on display for future generations? Now, apart from killing off the VC of Bolton, we have there 2 versions of the same story. But do these differences make THE your friend and the Times your enemy, or perhaps both of us your enemy, but to different degrees? No, I don't think they do. They reflect readership and audience and tone, but they also reflect the media doing its job, scrutinising, shining a light, holding to account, and just occasionally poking fun. Now, that's not to argue that all the coverage of higher education in the media is fair. It isn't, nor that it represents the precious diversity of the sector. It doesn't. But if you take a step back and take a look at what's going on, I think there's a clear divide, as others have said already, between the very positive coverage of research and the impact that science in particular has on our lives, think of the COVID vaccine, and negativity on issues relating to teaching and student issues, so free speech, contact hours, grade inflation, and so on. But I'm a big fan of pragmatic optimism, and in that spirit I think it's worth accepting that these hot button issues do exist, and then trying to understand what lies behind them as a necessary first step to addressing them. It's also worth acknowledging, I think, that the media is far more open to contributions from academics than it ever has been, and in my view this day-to-day presence does and will build support for universities over time, even if it is largely by osmosis and sits separately in our collective unconscious from the generalised angst about student debt and free speech. There are also, I think, some excellent examples of organised, media-savvy influencers within the sector. Not hand-wringing, not wailing and gnashing of teeth on Twitter. That serves very little purpose at all, and in my mind, far too much sector energy is spent on it. But if you look at the work that HEPI itself does to produce informed analysis, research, commentary on the issues that the country is actually talking about, even when those issues are uncomfortable. If you look at what the Science Media Centre has done over the course of the pandemic to ensure accurate, timely communication on exceptionally important, complex issues relating to everything from virology to epidemiology to sociology, the SMC has been a real standout and stellar performer for me. And I think you can't overestimate the value of that in building trust, both between academia and the public, and also the media and academics, which really matters. So my concluding advice is not to think about this relationship in terms of friend or foe. The media certainly doesn't look at universities in that emotive way, so I think it's pointless, frankly, to turn it into an emotive issue. Instead, focus on pragmatic engagement with the issues that matter to the public and therefore matter to the media. Don't fret over every negative headline, but do take notice when those stories become trends. And do expect the media to do their job, which includes pressing big red buttons. And above all, I think, consider what lies behind those hot button issues and how to engage with the specifics, particularly, as others have said, at a local level. The answer is rarely to say nothing to see here, even if you'd like it to be, and even if you genuinely believe that to be the case.
Thank you, John. Now it's your turn to get involved. Hopefully you've posted questions in the Zoom Q&A feature. Rachel Hewitt, Director of Policy and Advocacy at HEPI, will chair the discussion. Rachel's written about a wide variety of HE policy issues, including the future demand for higher education and the graduate gender pay gap. Rachel also led on the review of data of graduate destinations and designed and implemented the Graduate Outcomes Survey.
Thank you very much. And I thank you to our speakers, who I think have given us a really great basis to have a broader debate on this topic this morning. So I'm going to start with a question that's posed to Chris, but I think probably all the panellists will want to come in on. And that question's from Mary Kernock-Cook, which says, is the sector sometimes muddled about the difference between good policy and good, in this case, conservative politics? Should the sector be quicker to frame its comms to align with what ministers will see as favourable in a political environment, rather than arguing for the preferred policy position, free speech being a case in point? Chris, I don't know whether you want to come in first on that one.
Yeah, certainly. I found myself quite torn, when it came to trying to sort of communicate policy messages, because on the one hand, I do recognise the factual basis for statements. Higher education, probably more than any other sector, is swimming in a sea of statistics which are able to sort of prove particular sort of points and cases, and sort of as a result, academics and universities might say, well, there's not a problem here, there's simply not the evidence for something taking place, or they might sort of say, well, this is the wrong course of action. I was just thinking, actually, when I wrote a blog the other day on student finance, talking about the interest rate, and actually the majority of the comments on Twitter were to do with the fact that the interest rate is irrelevant, because actually the repayment, and actually the point I was making around debt was that it becomes a higher proportion of the overall spend owed. But the academics were picking up on the point, well, actually, I don't understand how the thing works, because of the financial package means that by 30 years it'll be written off, and it going right into the details. And that's fine, but it doesn't take away from the, as a politician, what we recognise as the emotional impact of policies, and sometimes that emotional impact is disproportionate to the actual detail of the policy. And that's where I would think universities do need to think clearly about what are policies that can be touch papers and sort of spin out of control. Another one was Vice Chancellor pay, when it was my predecessor, Joe Johnson, who clearly saw this as an issue, although at the time, Vice Chancellor said, well, we're running organisations that have 30,000 sort of individuals on campus and thousands of employers, and if you compare to, look over here, they're getting paid the same amount. And that's sort of whataboutery type of issue, where you're sort of looking at the cold judgment. But you can't make comparative judgments, and sometimes if you just simply rest on thinking about the policy should be based on cold, unemotional statistics, you're going to lose the argument. I think sort of, and that's the sort of key point, is that sort of some things do have a sort of disproportionality to them, is recognizing that disproportionality and trying to come up with ways of how to handle that. And I think sometimes we get into a stage in higher education where we think we've won the battle, because you managed to nail someone by proving them wrong using a statistic that highlights why their statement was in error. But you lose the war ultimately, because the person has still managed to get their point across, and you've not addressed their wider point that they're making, which is a values-based judgmental point as opposed to a statistical one. And that's where I would say universities need to think about, stop winning battles, which they're very proud of, but actually thinking about how you can engage with that sort of wider, supposedly a war. I mean, I was more in favour of more culture rather than and less war, but there is a culture war going on, and making sure that universities have their voice is heard, and rather than just denying that these points being made, and actually coming up with ways in which you can win over individuals, win over audiences is important. That means engaging in the emotional aspect of the politics rather than the policy.
Yeah, so understanding that balance between the factual side and the emotional side of responding to these conversations. Kirsty, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so I guess my thoughts on this is that I think the sector as a whole needs to sort of be aware and better aware of the politics and the reality as well of the politics. So I think too often we are on the back foot and then acting a little bit surprised when we see sort of policy changes implemented and then taken aback and then don't respond effectively. For example, free speech is an example. And I think the university being more externally aware and more engaged with politicians and the sort of direction of travel, if you like, I think we can be much more proactive in making our case. I agree with Chris here as well, that it's not so much about taking on the policy itself, but articulating it in a way that will be relatable and be relevant to the audiences that a lot of this politics, and policy is aimed at. And I'd use the example of the free speech bill that's going before Parliament at the moment. We have to accept as a sector that this has been coming for some time, and we need to make the case more clearly and more articulately around defence of free speech. And as Matthew said right from the outset, there are very few examples that are evident actually of cancel culture across universities, but we've been too slow to respond and make that case. And here we are in a position where there is legislation now coming down the line. So yes, we need to be better. We need to be more on the front foot. We need to be a bit more realpolitik about the sort of politics that's going on at the moment and respond effectively to it and proactively and be out there making the case before it happens to us rather than afterwards.
John, what's your view on how universities balance the sort of policy and politics picture?
Yeah, I suppose I agree with both my colleagues. I think the sort of killer stat that the sector tends to feel, kills all arguments stone dead, that's been around for a long time. The economic impact statement that will refute any argument in opposition to universities has been a weapon that has been deployed ineffectively over and over and over again, in my view, and it fails to sort of get to grips with, as you say, the sort of emotional narrative. I think there are ways that the sector can look ahead at what's coming down the road and actually align its many strengths with the issues that we will be talking about. For example, levelling up. I think the country is going to have the levelling up agenda as a really, chunky bit of public policy debate for the foreseeable future. But I also think it's there to be defined a certain extent. I'm not sure the government itself even really knows what levelling up means or is or does at the moment. And I think that universities, are in many ways almost the only example of institutions of national significance that I can think of that are everywhere. They're spread right across the country. They're not all in the southeast of England. And they have a huge part to play in whatever levelling up is, because clearly they are anchor institutions for economies, they are employers. They also have a lot of support locally. We all know from, a visit to a university campus where you jump in a taxi and the taxi driver says, "What do you do?" "I write about universities." "Oh, terrible, higher education, vice chancellor paid so much, students are in so much debt, too many people go to university." The minute you talk about the local university, "Oh, it's wonderful, my partner works there, I want my kids to go to study there," etc., etc. How do we cotton on to, particularly in the days when local media is in decline, how do we really sort of grab hold of that local support and turn it into something meaningful on a national basis? I think part of universities really thinking through what part they can play in shaping and delivering the levelling up agenda over the next 5 years, say, could be a really good place for them to start to sort of turn things around a little bit in how they're viewed, not just locally, but on a national basis too.
Absolutely. So our next question is from Paul Woodgates, and I suppose gets into some of the issues of the last year, because it asks, how do universities manage a public profile that reconciles their role promoting the public good through research and education with their role as providers of a product to consumers, aka students? And I suppose over the last year, we've seen really positive stories about the role that universities play in terms of research and less positive stories in terms of students' experience, perhaps. So Kirsty, do you want to come in first on that one?
Yeah, so well, we need to do both, don't we? And actually, by promoting the sort of value of great research that comes through universities, it is a way in which, obviously, research is one of the primary ways in which we demonstrate our public worth. And of course, as a world-leading research university, that's obviously key to the sort of education that we're providing with their students. So, so my answer is probably a bit of both, and we do need to make the case also, I think, for the quality of the education we provide. And this year it's been really tough, and we need to accept that. You know, the sector as a whole has worked tirelessly and under very difficult circumstances in order to provide a blended learning experience for our students. But it is, of course, not the education that our students wanted. And I think we also need to recognise that too often, I think, you know, historically universities have really focused their energies towards research, and, you know, we need to be better at improving the student experience. I think we need to be better at working more closely with our students. I think the good universities over the last year, in terms of their coronavirus response and how we manage our education, have done that directly through and working very closely and collaboratively with our students' bodies. And by doing that, you know, we've for example, at UCL, the student voice has been at the centre of all the decisions that we've made around education over the last year. And I think we also need to, in terms of the media, I think we need to sort of really make the case as to why a research-based, in the case of research universities, is really beneficial for students in terms of their education, in terms of their graduate employability outcomes. And also we need to work more closely with employers and demonstrate how we're working with employers to create the skills for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. John, did you want to come in on that one next?
I think it is a really fiendishly difficult question, isn't it? Why is there this divide between the huge respect, which has only, you know, gone through the roof over the last 12 months for science and research and the impact that it can have on all of our lives, and then all this culture war stuff that sits alongside it? I don't have an easy answer for that, I'm afraid. I do think of the something that Nick Hillman quoted at a THE event that he was speaking at a week or two ago, where he said, I think it was Britain Thinks has done this research. In fact, someone may have mentioned it earlier, where when you ask poll sort of general public, you know, what do you think about universities in terms of sort of public policy? They either don't think about them at all, or they think about them in terms of student fees and debt and value and all those issues. And they sort of forget that research is, you know, also something that goes on in universities. And then you mention it to these polling groups, and those groups suddenly say, oh yeah, research too. Yeah, we really value that. But for some reason, they're not connecting it to universities and the whole ecosystem of, you know, of what a university is. I think it's one of the regrettable features of the fees setup, which of course, you know, is where a lot of this stems from, the commercialization of higher education and the debt that students are being asked to take on. That, you know, the tuition fee was called a tuition fee rather than a university fee that pays for this ecosystem that actually delivers research-informed teaching, also helps subsidise research outcomes, and so on and so forth. I mean, that ship has sailed, so there's no point going back to that. But I do think it's one of the big, you know, very tricky questions that universities need to try and get a handle on if they want to get the media narrative about higher education back under control, to bring those two things together and to present a more united front in terms of the value that university deliver for all of us.
Absolutely. Chris, what do you think about how universities should balance these different roles that they play in terms of the media conversation?
So I think they can take lessons from one arm and translate it across the other. So, you know, the positivity that is naturally imbued with R&D. You know, the fact is that it's sort of a future-facing strategy. You know, new discoveries are going to be made that are going to change the world. You know, something the Prime Minister's bought into, with the sort of global science superpower narrative for the UK post sort of Brexit. And I'd say that, you know, what you learn the lessons of R&D is that sort of, you know, there's plenty of failure in the system, but it's never talked about. It's accepted as being part of that sort of process as you go towards discoveries and carving that future up. And I would say, in terms of student provision and what's happened this year, you know, yes, it has been awful for students. Yes, you know, it has been deeply disappointing for many students who have lost that. But also, you know, no one is blaming universities for what has happened with the pandemic. And I'd say to universities, you know, don't beat yourself up and sort of get into a sort of victim mentality where you need to dwell on this. You know, people don't necessarily blame the government for the pandemic. You know, they're still high in the polls at sort of 46%, you know, in terms of their voting, you know, versus 28%. And it just demonstrates that I don't think the people are in a place where they necessarily want to, you know, reach out and make attacks. And so universities, I think, just need to focus on the positives and on the task ahead, rather than sort of a post-mortem what's happened over the past year. You know, it's sort of, you know, there may be a time and a place for that, but I would say when it comes to the current cohort of students, trying to learn some of the lessons about sort of positivity and actually coming up with solutions. I would say, you know, when I was a minister, sometimes there was, you know, when it came to Brexit, and I said one of the questions relating to Brexit, I say, like, look, Brexit's happened. You know, we deal now with the situation where we are. We've got to come up with new research funding mechanisms, new ways for sort of new collaborative, you know, means for dealing with what we're going to be doing in the future. Very few people will actually in the sector want to actually engage with that. They just wanted to still complain about what had happened in the past. And, oh, well, we're missing out. Don't you realise that somehow we've lost this? And actually, that you don't need that. That's not sort of something that's going to be helpful or productive. And I'd say when it comes to students, and I'm going to give Mary Kernock-Cook a name check here. She's just signed up as the chair of the UPP Foundation's Student Futures Commission, recognising this cohort of students stretching back, obviously, those who are still at school, all the way to those who are leaving this year. We're going to be a unique generation where we need to craft as higher education a narrative of how we're going to support them through their journey, you know, given they're going to be difficult graduate opportunities ahead in a shrunken job market. You know, what's the role for universities to say, this is what we're going to do for you, this is how we're going to deliver? You know, put that in loco parentis argument aside for one moment. You know, I think the pandemic has completely changed the narrative of universities' responsibilities to their students. But let's get talking about what we're going to do and what are the policies that we can come up for the future about supporting this unique generation. And it will be unique for, you know, reasons that are both good and bad, rather than dwelling on the past. But that's what R&D does, you know, and it produces this sort of warm aura of future-facing sort of ideas and a mentality that is infectious.
Yeah, well, you've mentioned Brexit, and it feels like we should therefore take the question that's on Brexit, which is, do the panel feel that the perceived Remain stance of the sector on Brexit has changed forever the perception by people in the UK of universities and as independent and unbiased arbiters of the truth? You've already touched on this a bit, Chris, but I wonder whether you feel like it's had a long-term impact, the position that universities took on Brexit, on their perception.
Well, I think sort of university, well, we were all in a situation where the government had a very small majority. You know, I was a universities minister at a time when I really couldn't pass any legislation for, you know, for fear of the government losing the votes. And, you know, that's now changed. And universities need to, you know, recognise the reality of politics is the government has a majority of 80 and they either engage now and the laws will be passed whether they like it or not. And I think, you know, we were in a dynamic where you had, you know, two polarized views for whatever reason. I don't want to, you know, get into this sort of, you know, personally, it's over now in terms of we've moved on. Brexit is done, and yeah, this whole idea about some people still wanting to sort of think we could get a second referendum, all that was put to bed by the general election in 2019. But obviously, sort of going back to 2017, 2018, there was still a sort of, you know, dynamic where people sort of felt that things might work out differently. You know, that said, you know, the post-Brexit vision, whatever you think of Brexit, is where the government is at, it's where the media is at, it's where the country's at. You know, there is a huge hunger for thinking about where we will be in the 2020s and what course Britain will take. And obviously you get sort of people saying, oh, well, we're a diminished nation, you know, we've pulled up, you know, all that's irrelevant in terms of just coming up with ideas for the future, but also communicating those ideas and policies. So I would say that, you know, there is an opportunity here, and people may sneer and say, well, you know, I don't want to, there's no opportunity. How can you talk about opportunities post-Brexit? You know, opportunities for international research partnerships, to be those thinking of ideas to sort of cast those together. That's in the Global Britain sort of theme. Then there's obviously, John's mentioned, you know, levelling up. You know, that's also a key part of the post-Brexit sort of vision, where universities can be civic universities playing an active role as anchor institutions in areas which will be looking to improve their status for the future. I would say then there's this sense of the green agenda with COP26, and I know we've got universities COP26. Universities' role in climate change and communicating that to local communities. And then also, and I saw there's a question around STEM. I think STEM is so important for the UK because it's all about now the next stage of post-Brexit is around still sovereignty, and with sovereignty comes self-sufficiency. And it's that self-sufficiency argument I think universities are really well placed to try to drive, which is how do we sort of create sort of populations that are able to build industries, to be able to not necessarily rely on other countries such as China to manufacture goods in the past. And so, thinking about not necessarily solutions for the future, rather than thinking about Brexit as part of the problem, but potentially positive solutions is what the government and what the rest of the country want to hear. They don't want to hear about complaints about, oh, well, it would have been X, Y, and Z better if we'd stayed in Europe. And I mean, that's just, it's irrelevant, but also it potentially places university in a weakened situation where they're no longer seen as part of the solution, but are seen as part of the problem.
Sure. John, I'll put the question to you. Do you think universities' association with the Remain campaign has had a long-term negative impact?
Well, again, I agree with everything that Chris just said. I think certainly I recall John Curtis, who, as you know, is Professor of Politics at Strathclyde and a sort of election polling guru. Around about a year after the referendum, he felt quite strongly that universities had made a mistake in nailing their colours to the masts as firmly as they did. And that it had, in terms of sort of general public perception, hit them quite hard. I mean, I think the trouble with Brexit is it was such a divisive issue, split the country right down the middle, and you're either on one side or the other, and grudges have been held to a certain extent. So has it done them long-term damage? It probably has, amongst the 52% to a certain extent. I think, much like Chris, I feel this is water under the bridge, really. The big mistake the sector would make now is hanging on to that, worrying about it endlessly, going on to Twitter to as I say, gnash teeth and say, I told you so. That serves no purpose whatsoever. It's completely pointless. And I think, the point in terms of media relations is to move on and look at the issues that are being discussed now and how they can engage. And they absolutely can engage. University is going to be central, as Chris has said, to levelling up, to global Britain, to climate change and the UK's leadership position in that. I think it would be churlish to sort of, for example, take the global Britain idea and say, well, it's a Brexit idea, therefore we're not going to engage with it. No, that would be a big mistake. I think that would be where universities would be letting themselves down if they went down that route. I also think they have to be aware that anybody engaging with the media has to be aware that the news agenda moves on very quickly. I mean, a pitch 24 hours late may well have missed the boat in terms of the news agenda. So to be harping back to something that happened, God, when did Brexit happen? I can't even remember, 15 years ago, whenever it happened, would be, again, to really kind of misunderstood the way that news cycles work. And I think, getting much more pragmatic and realistic about the way the media work and engaging with issues. Otherwise, you just get overtaken events. And we've seen that, I think, over the last 6 to 12 months with issues like free speech really creeping up and clobbering the sector over the head.
Yeah, sure. Kirsty, did you want to come in on the topic of how we respond to
just
Brexit?
Really to say that I agree entirely with John and Chris. The agenda has completely moved on in terms of Brexit in the last year, particularly as we've been dealing with bigger and more immediate threats in terms of the coronavirus pandemic. And I can honestly say in the last year, I can't even recall the last time I saw an academic out and about whinging about Brexit. So I think it's very much done. And I certainly think that the sector is focused very much on how do we move forward and how do we play our part, as Chris says, in the post-Brexit agenda. And here is an area where I do think that universities have real opportunity to promote the value and importance of the university sector. I mean, global education is a real jewel in the UK's crown in terms of our economy, and we are attracting students from all over the world to come and study here. And in terms of our global soft power, universities have, UK universities are, and the value of a university degree in the UK is still so highly sought after. And we should be celebrating the fact that we are attracting so many students from around the world. And I think there's some astonishing figure, like 1 in 4 heads of state are educated at a UK university. And that we have as a sector, particularly in terms of the science agenda, and actually I think particularly with coronavirus and the extraordinary work that our academics have led on, for example, the Oxford vaccine has really demonstrated the just phenomenal role that we have as universities, and the fact that the UK is still a scientific superpower. I agree also around the levelling up agenda as well. And I think this is, this is an area where universities have an opportunity to demonstrate the value that R&D brings to their local economies and the benefit it brings to local people as well. So in a nutshell, yeah, Brexit, we've moved on. We recognise that as a sector. I don't think we're particularly talking about it. Also, in terms of the Brexit debate, I don't think it surprised anyone in Westminster or even in the wider public when some university academics and students took a view on Brexit. I do think though that in terms of institutional positions, I wasn't at UCL at the time, but UCL as itself did not come out with a position one way or the other. We as universities need to be places in which we host views from all sides of the debate. And as an institution, I think it's quite important that universities don't take a political position on a big issue of the day. We need to be the places where people can come together and have those conversations and challenge and debate and disagree well with each other. And we are communities where people hold a whole range of views. So I do think it is problematic when universities take a position on behalf of an entire community. And somewhere like UCL, we are nearly 60,000 staff and students now. That's the same size as a major city like City of St Albans, for example. And we cannot, as the institution, represent or take a view on behalf of our wider community when people hold, quite rightly, deep and diverging views.
Absolutely. It feels like an apt moment to follow on from that with a question about international media from Richard Hutchins, which says, so far we've largely focused on domestic media, but what are your views on the challenges and opportunities we face in the international media? It feels like a very important space, yet equally challenging. John, I don't know whether you want to come in first on that, because I know the Times Higher takes an international outlook.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we used to always be very UK oriented, but our audience has shifted quite a lot. I mean, higher education has become a very international endeavour, as I mean, it always was to a certain extent, but I think over the last, say, I don't know, 15 years, which is roughly how long I've been working for THE, it has only travelled further down that road, both in terms of research collaboration, academic careers, but of course, international student movement being the really crucial one. It's become this incredibly internationalized sector, and I think that has been very positive, but also at the moment does throw up a lot of challenges. Some of them just financial, the business model of many universities being hugely reliant on the movement of students, and students aren't moving at the moment. That's really problematic. But equally, in terms of the sort of geopolitics, as you have increasing stresses and strains with China as a potentially rival to the US as a global superpower, and you have these different views of many issues. So I think there are lots of issues that are not contained to domestic policy. They are very global. I mean, in terms of the global media, which since we're here to talk about the media specifically, I mean, I think the majority of media coverage of higher education, I would assume probably, other than perhaps THE, which is writing for a kind of the sector, so we're not writing for a sort of a general public audience. Most of it, I think, probably would be looking at higher education on a kind of domestic basis, or looking at it from a particular the angle of a particular country. And it is interesting to sort of look at how media around the world do view higher education. So I think the UK to a certain extent, Australia to a greater extent, pretty international. They understand how networked it is, how important that is. If you look at the US, very domestically oriented. I mean, it's an interesting aspect of the US sector that it is the sort of apex higher education sector, but it is also the one that is probably least interested in what's going on elsewhere in the world, perhaps because it's at the top of the tree and, you know, all roads flow to the US if you're amongst the elite, but very, very domestically oriented. So I don't know that if I was, you know, presumably the majority of the audience here are a sort of UK higher education, UK-based journalism students, that I would worry too much about what the international media are and aren't saying. I also think that when you're writing about higher education on an international basis, by necessity, you're quite issues focused. So it's the kind of, what are the big issues that are relevant to audiences around the world? And at that point, you start to pull away from some of the specific rows that we've been talking about earlier, things like free speech or domestic fees and debt. Those real kind of, you know, painful issues for universities move into softer focus just because of the nature of writing for sort of audiences that are very disparate and diverse.
Chris, do you want to come in on the role that universities should play in the global media?
Yeah, I'll just speak from a perspective of when I was a minister in terms of the strategy we had with international sort of education more broadly, because obviously the trend, and John alluded to it, was sort of to look at how we can make the UK higher education sector less dependent on China ultimately in the next decade. And that's not necessarily to say there's anything wrong with building strong relationships with China. It's just the concern around sustainability issues, particularly with some universities where a large number of international students are from China. And if for whatever reason, you know, that tap was turned off, then those individual institutions would face problems. So how do you create a more diverse portfolio for international students was sort of, you know, one of the government's priorities in the international education strategy that I published in 2019. And, you know, a key part of that strategy is just reaching out into those South Asian countries. And I'd say, you know, there are points where universities can potentially influence debates in the international media. You know, Education World Forum, whenever that happens in the UK, is potentially a moment. John talked about the media news cycle, sort of looking for points where there's, you know, conferences, delegates are being sent over to the UK as well, and trying to reach out, you know, to them or to the media might be covering their visits. I would just say also India, you know, is a key target market for the future. I don't have any understanding of how the sort of Indian media works, but you know, I recognise that there is a sense of, you know, of a growing economy, a sense of self-sufficiency and pride. You know, one of the reasons why it was very difficult to do any research partnerships with India using the ODA money is because they didn't want to accept ODA money. They recognise themselves as a superpower in their own right, and so, you know, understanding maybe that there may be media concerns there of us. I think what I would say is it's the UK reaching out to those countries and using their media to say, why are these countries important in their own right, not just as an act of charity to say, look, we're reaching out and building relationships with your developing economy so we can help you. Actually sort of pinpointing, you know, why we've chosen Vietnam, because, you know, say for instance, I just noticed the other day Vietnam now has more solar panels than the rest of South Asia, and it only started introducing solar panels as its energy supply since 2018. Yeah, it's a huge transformation. I mean, just one small example I just picked up off the media myself, but maybe it might be worth universities saying, you know, not what can we do for you, but what, you know, you can do for us, and building that reciprocity into their system and into their media narratives, I think is also highly important, because, you know, when it comes to partnership working and collaboration, you know, recognizing the value that these countries bring to universities will get you additional coverage as well as also additional reward, rather than it just being about you somehow implanting yourself in a country and offering them a service and a favour, which I think sometimes is one directional and misguided.
Kirsty, do you want to come in on the global role of universities in the media?
Yeah, so absolutely, international media is as important as domestic media. And also, I think I'd like to make the point that it isn't binary in that sense, in that stories that are published on Mail, the Daily Mail website, or Mail Online, are global news stories now, and likewise with The Guardian, for example, that's just got such a huge global international reach, or powering, stories that power BBC through world news. So I don't think it's an either or in terms of UK versus global media. But we clearly, international media and diversifying our audiences is hugely important, not least because the competition around international student recruitment is intense. And while the coronavirus pandemic, some of our competitors like Australia, for example, are less attractive, or if you can even get in as an international student. So we have an opportunity here for the UK to really demonstrate the value and impact of a UK-based degree and the research that we have here, and doing that through the international media is absolutely right. And pretty much every university press office in the country will have its own international media strategy. I agree with Chris actually that we should be looking to India as a real prime audience, and certainly some of the work that we're doing at UCL is aimed at a very much more sort of targeted approach to communicating our work and the value of it through Indian media, and not just through to Indian media, but also through to our global partners. So yes, it's essential. I mean, there is a resource issue here, of course, in terms of universities. We are, despite what you might read in the Daily Mail, not endless money pots. And actually, if you're going to be smart and clever and strategic around communicating to international media, you do need resources behind it. You can't sit here from London, as Chris says, and communicate to international media in a way that is telling them what we think they need to hear, rather than actually understanding who your target audience is on the ground, and how we can work with them rather than to them, if that makes sense.
Can I just add on the India point? It's really interesting that whenever we run stories about particularly post-study work opportunities, but anything to do with international student visas, that we get huge audiences coming from India, because there's just such an appetite to understand, as Kirsty says, what is the difference between the different study abroad options, where will I get the best opportunity, not just to study, but also to work. And we also know that there have been a couple of pretty high profile examples when sort of xenophobic attacks on Indian students in Australia, for example, were reported in the Indian media. It led to enormous drop-offs in the number of Indian students going to Australia. This is going back a few years now, but I think absolutely India is a place where media coverage can very significantly and quite quickly, I think, impact the flows of international students in particular, which, as we know, is financially hugely important.
Absolutely. Now, I've actually lost access to the questions, so excuse me paraphrasing to the people who put the questions in, but I know there are a couple of questions on who should speak out from universities. One on the role that students should play, and whether students are being sort of pitched against universities in the media conversation. And another about whether universities should sort of loosen their grip on who should speak out, whether it should just be senior leaders or there should be other people speaking out from universities. So Kirsty, I don't know whether you want to come in on who should be speaking on behalf of universities and the role that students can play in that conversation.
Yeah, so one of the wonderful things about UK universities is our deep commitment to academic freedom and free speech. And so the answer quite simply is, I think, anyone. And we at UCL would encourage and support our staff and students to be speaking up on whatever the issue is of the day. And I don't recognise this. I think what was this frame? The question's framed universities loosening their grip on who speaks. I doubt that any university has a grip on their academics speaking out, and nor should they. So I do also think that, particularly I'm thinking about the student body, that when you read stories in the media, it is always often through the lens of the dissatisfied student who hasn't had the sort of experience that they would want or expect. And the truth is actually that the reality, which is that there are a lot of students that value their university education, that think they've received a good education, that are happy, is not necessarily the news story that journalists want to write. I think that's the challenge. Yes, I think, back to the point I made at the beginning, I think one of the positives of universities that we have these huge communities that we need them to act and speak more as advocates for the sector. I think particularly academia is so fractured sometimes. I think sometimes academics speak from their own individual department or their own individual piece of research, sometimes don't see themselves as connected to part of that wider institution. I think here's where university can do a lot around creating a culture which, in which students and our staffs and our communities feel proud of the institutions they work for and want to speak up for them in a positive way, want to be advocates for them, rather than throwing stones from the sidelines, as is often the case.
Chris, do you have a view on sort of what has cut through in terms of who speaks from universities and the different people who speak out on behalf of universities?
I mean, having sort of not worked, and have the experience that someone like Kirsty does, I feel rather loath to say this because sort of, on the one hand, university academics want to get on with their research and do the job they're being paid for. Yet obviously certain academics at certain universities become, for whatever reason, famous in their own right, so they become sort of mini celebrities. Is it fair for universities to lean on them in addition to provide sort of voices, because we know that they'll get cut through as a result of their status? You've got the Nobel Prize winners in the Manchesters or UCLs of this world, but then you might be like the great Brian Coxes or sort of various other people who are sort of become TV personalities as well, who also can speak for universities, and they'll get cut through just because of the virtue of their names. I would say it might be worthwhile sort of universities thinking in advance as part of that sort of proactive forward-facing strategy about a spokesperson sort of team to try to create their own sort of framework by which there's individuals who are willing to articulate sort of particular views with the media rather than necessarily leading up to the departments. I mean, it may be the case that universities already do that, I'm not necessarily sure, but basically actually have a sort of grid system where we're going to be able to say these are the people we can make sure we have given them the training and we've got the briefing, in the same way as like politicians, we've got the sort of lines to take and we're all got the sort of stuff that's all ready to go, so you can anticipate sort of the questions in advance. And I would say just on students that not every student is a student activist. I think sort of if a student is going to be in the media, it's obviously for sometimes tragic reasons, for reasons of sort of a grievance, or that they're sort of one of the 2% of students who are sort of actively engaged in student activism. I think it's important that we sort of recognise that if students are appearing in the media, they're not necessarily your normal student who just wants to be getting on with their work quietly and get a good degree, or go out and enjoy themselves. Sort of, it's not necessarily the union. Important that I really value the work that unions do, and I think there's more the universities can do to engage the unions around particular levelling up agenda in terms of charitable work. Some really fantastic examples, but they are atypical when it comes to sort of strategies and communicating with the media. So I would just say those are my sort of views on potentially what might happen. But I think as always, universities say, well, we're already doing that, but it'd be clear to me that that'll be a way forward.
Absolutely. John?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question that Chris raises about sort of who the superstar communicators are. I mean, it would be an interesting perhaps a thesis for someone at University of Gloucestershire in the journalism school about who is of more value in terms of communication to the University of Manchester. Is it Andre Geim, brilliant researcher, Nobel Prize winner, or is it Brian Cox, brilliant communicator who has these incredible audiences? How do you deploy the two, and how can they sort of what are the different benefits they bring to you as an institution in terms of your public profile and how you talk to the world? I mean, I do think that, as I said in my opening remarks, that academics are more visible and more vocal within the media than we perhaps realise or recognise. I think, you know, if you look at particularly, you know, serious programming, news programming, probably, you know, showing my age, but if you pick Radio 4 and you look at the Today programme or PM, it's packed with academics talking and commentating on everything, not just science and COVID, but, you know, all sorts of issues. And I think that is really valuable and is really important, and probably does more than we realise or acknowledge in terms of the public understanding of what universities are doing. So I think that's really important. I also think there's a question of how it's the news cycle. As I say, it's really quick. You have to look for hooks. You have to be specific if you want to get stories written. No one ever commissioned a warm bath, but that's often what the sector delivers in terms of its unified. I don't want to be rude about UUK, because I think UUK does a great job in many ways, and I'm not knocking the comms team there at all, because it's tough. But if you're trying to present a unified front of this is what higher education thinks, you often end up with something so vague and warm and cuddly that, you know, who's going to write about it? So I think it's not just a question of who, but what and how quickly and how specific you're being in terms of tackling debate, and also getting ahead of the debate, being open. I think of, you know, the story in the last week of Essex, which had a free speech row, as I'm sure you all have seen. There was a review suggesting that they should not have cancelled a couple of talks that happened there, and the Essex Vice Chancellor got ahead of the debate, published a blog, you know, on the day that the piece came out, and essentially apologised and said we got this wrong. And I think that's the kind of proactive response that is also needed from university leaders. I think, you know, being bold probably wins the day, even when you know, that was clearly a negative story in terms of Essex.
Now, we've had a couple of questions around sort of subject areas, and I think this probably relates to some of the debate that we've seen over the last year or couple of years around low value courses and what courses come under that category. And one of the questions asked, to what do the participants attribute the promotion of STEM subjects for students, even among politicians and journalists who studied the humanities? So with the greater focus on STEM, is there a sort of disparity between that, when many journalists and many politicians will have studied the humanities or social sciences? Chris, do you want to come in on that first, about the low value debate?
Yeah, certainly. So I think when it comes to understanding, well, yeah, the government is with STEM. I think, as I said, there is this sort of push for the future of the UK to be a global science superpower, to transform its economy. And I think that's the thing, is that, you know, we will see in the next decade there's a push to re-engineer the economy, whether rightly or wrongly, from the centre, towards a more sort of technological, research-based sort of economy, a more self-sufficient sort of economy. And we're going to need that additional human capital. You know, they've looked to sort of open up sort of visa programs as well to bring in international researchers, but also there's going to have to be a transformation around the skills base. And I think this whole post-18 education system reform, you know, it's working towards trying to raise not only sort of productivity levels and, you know, that sort of band of post-18s who are stuck at sort of level 3 or below, but also to recognise we need 250,000 people doing extra research in this country if we're going to hit 2.4%. And so, you know, having those sort of people doing the STEM subjects are incredibly. I think there's also this sort of emotional aspect to it. Around the sort of the self-sufficient sort of engineer, sort of the capability for the UK PLC in future not to rely necessarily so much on other countries, and particularly for the green technologies that will be coming on board in the next sort of 10, 20 years. Will we be able to have our own sort of workforce as well as being able to manufacture these technologies? I would say, when it comes to, you know, the humanities debates around sort of low value, that clearly I think there are two issues here. I obviously, as a historian, passionately believe in the value of the humanities. I also believe that from an international perspective, the reason why international students want to come to the UK is because of the critical thinking and the quality of the arts and humanities offer that the UK, which is world leading, and it would be nonsensical for us to somehow jettison that and lose that comparative advantage But there is a separate debate to be had, which is potentially more of a policy debate than a communications debate, but it will quickly become a massive communications debate in the media, which is around what are our universities for going in the future? Should they be providing for every single course? Should every university have a universal system of every department? We've seen obviously Sheffield now with the Department of Archaeology potentially closing down. We've seen history at Sunderland go. A while back I think it was English and Exeter, and then there's a debate in Leicester around medieval studies. These are uncomfortable debates to be had, but potentially we could be focusing our attention on how to create world-leading hubs of subjects, so that there are partnerships and collaborations with universities, which means that there are mergers taking place amongst departments for those subjects, because it might be that the sustainability of having a single history department in every university across the country is no longer possible. Now, that's not me being anti-humanities or anti-history saying that. I'm just recognizing the reality of what may need to come. But as a result, it's about how do you maintain quality within the subjects that I think is so important here, and maintaining the opportunities for students to study. It might mean they're not able to study their subjects at their local university, but nevertheless, how can we ensure the self-sufficiency and sustainability of those subjects continues? So I think those are sort of my views on that. I passionately believe in the value of the humanities and the arts. But I also recognise that we need to potentially reform in the future if we're going to be able to make the case for why they're needed.
Thank you. John, what's your view on how universities should balance between the sort of STEM and social science or humanities debate in the conversations around value?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, clearly, I think the idea that history should only be offered at Oxbridge is hugely problematic. I think in terms of the media, there's a story that we're all familiar with, which goes something like this: far too many people go to university, many are victims of a Ponzi scheme doing useless degrees at far too high a cost, and we need more plumbers. And I think we would all disagree with that, except for the bit about needing more plumbers. But the story can be told another way, which is that far more people go to university than ever before, making them far more representative of the country at large. But university isn't for everyone, and other routes are available and important. And by the way, universities also work alongside many of those routes. So the idea that universities aren't also producing incredibly important public service roles through vocational routes, the nurses in your local hospital, the teachers in your kids' school, and so on. I think that it's shifting that narrative, and this is not so much about humanities, but shifting it away from being the sort of, again, the big national HE is a Ponzi scheme debate, down to the kind of local level. What is actually going on, and how is it delivering for the students, delivering for people in the local region and economy, delivering for the services that you rely on. And I do think that, like Chris, I studied history at university, and it has served me extremely well. And I think people being vocal about that and honest about that, and not saying actually the only way to go on and be successful in your chosen profession and so on and so forth is to study STEM. It's simply not true.
I would agree with that as a social science graduate. Kirsty, any reflections from you?
I'm going to finish off the trio. I'm an ex-classicist, so I am also, having studied Latin and ancient Greek, which if you believe the media, would have absolutely no value in the modern world at all, and I couldn't disagree more with that. And I'm just thinking, listening about how the humanities debate at the moment is just a real prime example of how the media debate has become quite polarized and binary, in the sense that STEM is good, humanities are bad, sort of narrative that's now emerging, and is exactly the sort of area that I think that university leaders and sector bodies should really be out there making the case for the arts and humanities. And we need it as a nation as well. I mean, let's face it, I mean, employers still value humanities degrees and the sort of critical thinking that arts and humanities graduates bring, the creativity, and also, again, just thinking as well around the sort of the way that Rosie Bennett points about how university education often thinks through that consumer lens. And one of the classic examples always cited is, you know, oh, if you study history, you only get 10 hours a lecture. If you put a pound sign on that, that's only X, Y, Z. But that's without a sort of willful sort of misunderstanding of what a humanities education looks like, and that if you study history, a huge part of that is around being independent in your study and critical in the way that you approach your studies. So I think this is an area that I think we'll be seeing more voices coming through in the sector. We're seeing campaigning groups already starting to mobilise, particularly in the lights of the OFS's cuts to arts subsidies as well, which is going to sort of disproportionately affect some institutions. So again, just this is exactly the sort of area where I think the sector needs to be speaking up. We can see the direction of travel here, and we need to be out there defending our arts and humanities subjects.
Absolutely. Now, there are still lots of fantastic questions that I haven't had a chance to get to in the Q&A, but I think we're coming to the end of our time. So thank you for all the questions that have been submitted. And I'll pass back to Matthew for the final word.
So thank you, Rachel. That does indeed bring this discussion about universities and the media, friend or foe, to an end. And perhaps as a philosophy graduate, I'm perfectly happy to accept the answer directly to that question, is friend or foe? Well, it's either, neither, and both. But I think there was also something very practical for us to take away from that, certainly that I will take away, a clear encouragement to engage with the media, and when doing so, perhaps to think of two things. One of all, simplicity. How do we make sure that we get a simple, clear message that really cuts through? It's not the killer fact, it's the simplicity of the message, and then secondly, it's the emotion that comes with that message. How do we make a message more values-based rather than simply factual? So I'd like again to thank all our panelists, Chris Skidmore, Kirsty Walker and John Gill, for taking part and sharing their views. I'd like to thank Ulani and Rachel, and to say that from all of us here at the University of Gloucestershire, goodbye and have a good day.